Welcome to the Holy Post. For decades, most Americans have said other people simply cannot be trusted. The exception was among churchgoers who reported more faith in their neighbors. But new data says attending church is no longer a boost to social trust. So what's changed? Then, why are political conservatives suddenly talking much less about abortion and a whole lot more about transgender issues? Young Earth creationists and Christian nationalists seem to be flirting. What's the attraction? And Caitlin Chess talks to author and Instagram historian Jasmine Holmes about her new book, Crowned with Glory, and the overlooked stories of how Black Christians shaped American history. All of that, plus Phil has a disturbing story about rats, slugs, and worms. Before we jump in, a couple of announcements. First, we have a brand new episode of our sub-series, Why I'm Still a Christian. This time, Phil talks with Russell Moore. And for HOLYPOST Plus subscribers, there's a new Holy Post office where we answer a question submitted and voted on by you, our listeners. This time, it's about what Christian mission should look like when it's done right. We also have a new Holy Post book club selection coming soon, and a new episode of Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess, where she teaches me everything I need to know about Taylor Swift. It's actually more theological than you'd believe. For access to all of that and much more, go to holypost.com and learn how you can become part of the Holy Post Plus community. Okay, here is episode 585.
Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. It's me, Phil Vischer. This is the Holy Post Podcast. You came to the right place. I'm here with Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil.
And Christian Taylor. Hi, Christian.
Hey, Phil.
Have you been out of the country in the last 2 weeks since we talked to you last?
Nope. I've been here.
Been out of the state? Not even out of the state?
Well, 2 weeks ago, I was in Madison, Mississippi once again. But
yeah,
I've been really busy at home.
Okay.
Yeah, trying to maintain the home fires, and it's been a good thing, actually. I'm tired of traveling.
Okay, and Skye, have you been anywhere? Yeah, you were somewhere.
I was in California.
You were in California. That's where you were.
I was.
Okay.
Yes, I was.
And you may or may not have been with some old common friends of ours, if my wife is noticing things correctly on Facebook.
We were with Tim and Kelly Johnson.
Yeah.
They're coming to my house next week.
What? Oh,
yeah.
Gosh.
I'm so excited.
What a world.
What were you guys doing?
For Kelly's 50th birthday, Tim got her a trip to Napa Valley, and she asked us to come along and join. And so we enjoyed harvest time in Napa. It was gorgeous.
Well,
I bet.
Happy birthday to Kelly Johnson. And now it's time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. This episode of the Holy Post is sponsored by Faithful Counseling. In my 50 years on this earth, life has thrown me more than a few curveballs. The loss of a dream, rough spots in relationships, challenges in parenting. Even though friends and family and strangers on Facebook are always ready with advice, my wife Lisa and I have found it tremendously helpful to sit down with a professional therapist. And you can too. Faithful Counseling can help you find a therapist that works for you. With more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states, it's easy and free to change counselors until you find the right fit. Plus, it's more affordable than traditional in-office counseling, and financial aid is available. Whether you're struggling with family conflicts, trauma, anxiety, stress, or depression, Faithful Counseling can match you with a Christian therapist who can help. Continue growing into the best version of yourself. Visit faithfulcounseling.com/holypost and get the professional, faith-based counseling you need. They've even got a special offer for our listeners. Right now, you can get 10% off your first month at faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. And thanks again to Faithful Counseling for sponsoring this episode. It's kind of funny as we see all of our friends crossing 50. Skye, how long will it be?
I've got 3 years.
All right. We'll have a special event.
Do you know what that means?
No, what does it mean?
It means that you and I are
No.
crossing No. Yeah, let's don't talk about that.
Okay. Okay. Let's jump right in. I've got a new department It's a bureau. This is from our bureau of As If You Didn't Have Enough to Worry About. I don't know.
I like that.
Yeah, I don't know if you've met the team at that bureau. They're just getting set up in downtown Wheaton currently so they can keep us abreast of things to add to our pile of worries. Worm that jumps from rats to slugs to human brains has invaded the southeast United States.
Oh, that sounds
Exciting?
disgusting.
Exciting?
Is that the only route it can take?
Oh, you just wait. Wait till you hear about that route.
Okay.
Multiple rats in Atlanta have tested positive for calamitous, rapidly spreading parasite. When they use the word calamitous, you know...
Can't be good.
It can't be good. The dreaded rat lungworm. Have you heard of the rat lungworm?
No, but it sounds disgusting.
A parasite.
Sounds like a heavy metal band.
Parasite with a penchant for rats and slugs that occasionally finds itself rambling in human brains has firmly established itself in the southeast U.S. and will likely to continue its rapid invasion. So says a study published this week. Okay, you want to hear the life cycle of a rat lungworm?
I don't know. Do we?
You don't, but you're going to. And I apologize in advance. Normally, adult worms live in the arteries around a rat's lungs, hence rat lungworm. There, they mate and lay eggs. The worm's larvae then burst out of the lungs, get coughed up by the rat, and then are swallowed by the rat and eventually pooped out. From there, it is also news of the butt. From there, the larvae are picked up by slugs or snails as they eat the rat poop. Okay, so it goes from the rat's lungs to inside slugs and snails. The larvae then develop in the slugs and snails, which ideally are then eaten by rats. Back in the rat, the late-stage larva penetrates the intestines, enters the bloodstream, and migrates to the rat's central nervous system and brain. There they mature into subadults, then migrate to the lungs, where they become full adults and mate, thus completing the cycle. Is that the freakiest thing you've ever heard?
Who came up with that idea? We need to have a conversation with the creator.
Apparently
because
God.
I don't understand. I don't understand
I want to hear.
this.
I want to hear Elton John break out in Circle of Life all of a sudden.
It's the most disgusting circle of life in history. Humans become accidental hosts in various ways. They may eat undercooked snails or inadvertently eat an infected slug or snail hiding in their unwashed salad. Infected snails and slugs can also be eaten by other animals first, like frogs, prawns, shrimp, or freshwater crabs. If humans then eat those animals before fully cooking them, they can become infected. Now here's where it gets fun. When a rat lungworm finds itself in a human, it does what it usually does in rats. It heads to the central nervous system and ultimately to the brain. The migration of the worms to the central nervous system can be asymptomatic, but sometimes it can cause severe neurological dysfunction. This can start with nonspecific symptoms like headache, light sensitivity, and insomnia, and develop into neck stiffness and pain, tingling or burning of the skin, double vision, bowel or bladder difficulties, and seizures. In severe cases, it can cause nerve damage, paralysis, coma, and even death. So, are you having trouble sleeping at night? Sure, maybe you just have a lot of stress in your life, or
I
maybe
have a tingling down my
Okay,
down
we're not.
my
We can't do this.
shoulder
We
and
cannot
a
do
pain
a
in
cherry.
my neck.
No.
But here, let me
cannot-
ask you this. Every
Christian.
single one of those symptoms can
Yeah.
be something else.
Yeah.
So how in the world
I
do they
know.
discover it in a human?
I know. I don't know. I don't know why they would
Okay.
even think to look. Maybe you got worms in your brain. Maybe that's why you're
First
not
of all-
sleeping well at night.
This cannot turn into another geriatric episode where we talk about all of our problems. Number 2, all the ways you can get this sound like I think I'm pretty safe because all the stuff that it could be in,
Yeah.
I really don't like eating. I don't like snails. I
either.
don't like crabs. I don't like shrimp.
I'm
don't like
certainly
shrimp?
not
Okay.
eating rats.
I
Right.
like shrimp, but I think I'd notice if it was undercooked.
I don't. Well, and shrimp, I don't mind the taste. It's the texture. I'm just not
Yeah.
a fan. But then third, tell me, Phil, please tell me
Yes.
that there is an effective treatment for someone who may have these worms.
It doesn't say. We better look that
That's
up.
kind of critical information,
it
isn't
doesn't
it?
say. Blah, 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 blah. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I
Not
did
good.
read. It makes me think of the story. Do you remember that woman who was having trouble, like her whole like eyes were going bad and all this stuff was happening, and they did surgery on her brain because they thought it was something in her brain, and there was a giant worm that crawled out when they were doing the surgery,
Really?
and that was the cause of all of her problems, and it was like, pretty long worm.
Can't they tell that in an MRI or CAT scan or something before going in?
I guess they missed it.
if you know
but
what you're
apparently,
looking for.
our brains are pretty good hosts for worms, it seems.
Yeah, I don't like that idea.
Me either.
I just don't like that idea at all. And if the worm affects your cognitive abilities, and maybe because of your declining cognitive abilities, you change your beliefs, is the worm part of God's plan? I don't know. It just gets, I have so many theological questions that I just don't know what to do with. I don't feel like I'm armed with the necessary tools.
I really do come back to asking, why did God think this was necessary?
Oh, Sky,
Well-
for everyone who's just listening, Sky just rolled his eyes. So now we're going to find out why Sky just rolled his eyes.
I don't have a clear answer for that, but I think sometimes it's a little bit like, well, why are there hurricanes and why are there earthquakes
Yeah.
and why are there, rat lung worms? And some of it people want to attribute to God's direct, bad behavior or evil intentions or something terrible like that. The other way of looking at it is it's just part of an unordered world.
Mm-hmm.
So, like Dr. Walton talks about Genesis 1 and all that, and he talks about how there's disorder and unorder. Like at the beginning, there's just the water, the sea, the chaotic primordial sea, and the Spirit of God hovers over the water. And he talks about that being the unformed world, and then God brings order out of it, separating land and sea and sky and on all that. But then you have disorder, which is like when the serpent steps in and causes the man and the woman to rebel against God, and that introduces disorder, where it's like you're breaking up the order that already existed. So things like hurricanes and earthquakes and all that could just be unorder. It's not evil disorder, if that makes sense.
Do you think the serpent, when he came into the garden, had a little box of rat lungworms?
I knew where that was going.
Maybe he was a rat lungworm.
There are some really disturbing parasitic creatures,
Yes.
even the fungus that makes bugs behave strangely so that it can be in the right place to pop out of its brain and infect another. That's some disturbing stuff, and I have a hard time chalking any of that up to God's perfect design for it. Mm-hmm. It's like if when Jesus comes back and sets everything right and we have creation redeemed and made whole, I'm going to go out on a limb and say there won't be any parasitic rat lungworms. Or if they are, they'll be very friendly fellows who just want to actually massage your brain to a higher plane of being. So that's what I'm going to say.
Well,
there.
one thing that I think about oftentimes when I hear discoveries of things that just seem absolutely unbelievable, whether it's with science or, nature, I do wonder if the Lord has tucked away things in this world where, he wants us to discover them, and see his marvelous creation.
But not sinister things.
No, but it does, it does make me think about, his creation.
Because if cancer is human cells kind of going rogue, going bad. And so maybe that happens in the animal kingdom as well. Maybe rat lungworms are like, biological cancer and parasitic wasps and really weird stuff. Maybe that's just biology, kind of saying, we're not going to do what you want us to do, God. We're going rogue.
Well, the Bible does say once he returns and sets everything right, there will be no illness and there will be no disease. So there must not be lungworms,
right. The
that could
snail
give us
will lie
disease.
down with the lungworm.
Right. Right.
and they will be friends. Okay,
They will be redeemed.
Something has been. I'm noticing something that's kind of bugging me a little bit, and I wanted to bring it up because I think I've discovered something. Okay.
Is this a bee in your bonnet, Phil?
It might be a bee in my bonnet, or it might just be, hey, I think I found out that what people say they believe in this particular case is not actually what they believe. So
Let us have it.
Sky and I were taken to task quite a bit a few years ago for not prioritizing the legal demise of abortion as much as we should. And one of the things, and Sky can disagree if he wants, but one of the things that people threw at us is that it is the slavery of our day, it is the Holocaust of our day. 60 million babies have died since Roe was passed. There is nothing more important than ending abortion in America. And, when someone comes at you with that, it's a little bit hard to convince them they should care more about maternal mortality or poverty. When you say, has poverty killed 60 million kids in America in the last 50 years? Well, no, I guess not. So they were kind of using this particular group of people that I interacted with a great deal online, was kind of using abortion as a trump card, literally and figuratively, because of the body count. Like nothing demands our attention until it rivals the body count of abortion.
Right.
That changed this year because now some of those same people I'm seeing say that the transgender movement and transgender ideology is the battlefront of our day. And I just have to point out that the body count from transgender ideology is nowhere near the body count of abortion. So I'm not...
Or poverty.
Not sure. Right. So we're elevating, and now when you go, wading into far right Christian social media circles, those two things have become like the wicked stepsisters of the decline of Western civilization, abortion and transgender ideology. Yes, Guy.
I have a question.
Yes, Guy.
I mean, I think they can do this partly because they know that both abortion and pro-trans stuff aligns politically. Like, it isn't like one party is pro-life and the other party is anti-trans. Mm-hmm. They're aligned. Right. So there's no contradiction in their mind because it's still all pro-Republican.
Here's the contradiction. We can't care about anything else until there is no more abortion unless something else is killing more people than abortion. So, because I've heard that exact argument. Oh, right. Yeah, and how many people are being killed by racism today in America? How many people were lynched this year in America? Now look at abortion. So we don't care about racism until we solve abortion. Except now transgenderism just blows that completely out of the water.
But in their mind, it doesn't, because if you are voting against transgender rights, you are still voting against abortion. Because it's all aligned with the same party. So they're not seeing it as a contradiction because you're still voting pro-life if you're voting anti-trans legislation.
And maybe...
What they're really saying, though, is nothing is more important than abortion if it's coming from the Democratic side of the spectrum. That's what they're saying.
Do you think they would admit that they're saying that?
No.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and maybe it's a case of... We've had abortion on the radar since the early 80s. That's been a hot button topic, really even a little bit before that. And so everybody's familiar with that. We all know what that argument's about. And now, since we're all familiar with that, we've had a little bit of victory in that area. Maybe it's time to shift our focus, educate people on this other terrible ill. No?
Yeah. I agree with you, Christian, except what's really going on here is since Roe was overturned, the Republicans have been losing on the abortion issue politically. Where they make abortion front and center, they lose. Just talked to David French about this for last week's French Friday. So they need to come up with a different issue that's going to scare and motivate their voters that they can win on, and that's why the trans thing is coming up so much now.
That makes sense.
And internally, I think the way they justify it is the way I said, is, well, we're not asking you to be pro-life now. We're just asking you to shift your focus to the trans thing, but it's all in the service of voting for one political party. What would be the real test is if an issue came up that they genuinely believed was the most important issue, no longer abortion, and it required you to vote for someone else. But that's not,
that's
I mean,
not
it's so
gonna
transparent.
happen.
It's not going to
That's not
happen.
going to happen. I'm just curious how we all, me included, how we assess the priority of evils that we are opposing. You know, because a lot of people come to different conclusions. Like, this is the one thing. This is the one thing. Mental health is the thing that's bringing down kids and the church, and so mental health. Until we solve mental health, just that should be our 100% focus. And then if you say, well, actually, I think it's generational poverty, or I think it's racism, or I think it's the environment. And there are other people. Until we solve the environmental crisis, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have intergenerational poverty if you don't have water. So, or your crops burn up. So I think it's interesting to think about our metrics when we try to figure out what is the worst evil we're facing, and then we get mad at other people for coming to different conclusions. And I do want to make sure that I don't automatically discount someone just because they came to a different conclusion than I do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this gets into the bigger question, not just about what evils are we voting against, but I mean, there's no shortage of terrible, evil things in the world. Like we were talking about, crazy parasites and diseases and cancers and things like that. So it even lends itself to what should I be giving my life to?
Yeah.
For a long time, a lot of conservative evangelical Christians said, well, the only thing that matters is evangelism. It's saving souls. It's rescuing people off the sinking ship, as if, cancer and poverty and racism and abortion don't matter because, it's just all going to burn. So all of this lends itself back to a theology of vocation or calling. And that means every Christian should be really deeply seeking God's guidance for their own lives, for their own work, for their own vocation, for their own generosity and giving, and for their vote. It's part of just being a disciple. And if a Christian has done that and they've come to a different order of priority of what determines their vote, or what determines their giving, or what determines their time commitment or vocation, as long as they've done that in communion with God, amen, wonderful, good. I'm glad you're obedient to what Christ is calling you to do, but don't condemn somebody because they've come to a different set of priorities, because it's a different calling.
Yeah, I think the thing that discourages me is when you use your metric to disqualify someone else's passion.
Totally.
So if someone like David French and Karen Swallow Prior both devoted a big chunk of their lives to pro-life causes, and I'm not going to say, well, that was wrong because you should have devoted your life to this. And I don't think someone now should say, well, now you have to switch and devote your life to opposing gender ideology. That's like there's we all have to be on, someone somewhere decides this is the thing that we care about this decade, everyone else, or you're doing it wrong, or you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
And it's sort of that, I'm looking for a way to look at the world where I'm the righteous one and people who disagree with me are the unrighteous ones.
John Piper did a very famous sermon at a conference, I don't know how many, 20 years ago now, and he ended up doing a book about it called Don't Waste Your Life. And the whole message was about, if you commit to anything other than ministry and the mission of the gospel, you're wasting your life. Which is, it's a very demeaning...
Hello, Christian. Who's calling?
Oh,
Sorry.
Is that it's not your back phone.
No, it isn't.
Well, it's a good transition because we should all answer the call that Christ has given us. And it's going to be different for different people.
It's world missions.
But that's the same thing as saying you can only vote this way and be an obedient Christian.
That's it. That's all. Everyone in America needs to move somewhere else to tell people about Jesus. And America must be evacuated. Okay.
But it's the same argument with your vote.
Yeah,
isn't it?
It is. Yeah. It is. Sky, have you ever attended the Fight, Laugh, Feast conference?
I know, but I've had something that feels like that in some of my family Thanksgivings.
What would you even, Christian, if someone said, would you like to come to the Fight, Laugh, Feast conference, what would you even think you were being invited to? And then they would say, oh, it's a Christian conference.
Oh, it's a Christian conference.
Yeah, it's a Christian conference.
Fight, Fest, Feast.
What if I told you that it's taking place at the Ark Encounter in Kentucky?
I don't even know what that is, but it sounds like some medieval, like, Renaissance
We'll be
duel.
jousting.
Is the Ark Encounter like hosting a fight where they like battle endangered species and then they cook and eat them at the end?
Oh, that's an interesting idea. Yeah.
And pray a lot beforehand.
Christian, the Ark Encounter is Ken Ham's.
The Ark, as in
Yes,
Ark
A-R-K. A-R. You've got the Creation Museum, which does not start with a K, and then the Ark Encounter, which has a K. Creation should start with a K too, just to make it work out. Anyway, the Ark Encounter is hosting the Fight, Laugh, Feast 2023 conference, which is about Christian nationalism, which includes the guests Stephen Wolfe, Joel Webbon, and Douglas Wilson, who are
they
three
speaking
big
out
names.
against it?
Those are
No.
three big names promoting Christian nationalism. So
now they're embracing this term.
yes.
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
this is a pro. Douglas Wilson started Canon Press, which published Stephen Wolfe's book, the argument for the case for Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And boy, does he have a bad case of Christian nationalism. Anywho, so now you have Ken Ham and the Young Earth creationists kind of joining arms with Stephen Wolfe and the Christian nationalists. So now we have
They know their market. They know their
Young
market.
Earth creationist nationalists. And I'm just curious, what's the crossover between those?
Can I
Sky
guess?
Jatani.
I need a bell to ring in. Ding, 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 ding. I will take homeschool curriculum for 300, Alex.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, because Canon Press, Douglas Wilson also is a leader in homeschool curriculum, and so is Ken Ham. So there's that. I will take general culture warring for 400, Alex, because Ken Ham also believes the culture is out to get our kids, as do Christian nationalists. And Ken Ham has been expanding his purview of issues to be mad about beyond just Genesis denialism, which he's accused me of, to transgender movement and gay rights and every other way, because in his mind, all of this comes back to letting go of a literal reading of Genesis 1.
Right. And that's my biggest question about this whole thing. Ken Ham and the Young Earth creationists, their whole foundation is you need to read the Bible literally and take it seriously. Okay, fair enough. If you do that, how on earth can you come to the conclusion that America is God's chosen people?
But that's
and
that's one strain of Christian nationalism, because what a lot of these more intellectual Christian nationalists are arguing for, not as much about taking the Bible literally as taking Calvin literally, and taking the 16th century reformers literally.
But the irony is they didn't take Genesis 1 literally.
That's not the point. I don't think the Christian nationalists care as much about Genesis 1 as Ken Ham does. That's Ken Ham's bailiwick.
I know, but it's just the whole... Yeah, it's just such a weird construct.
I think you ought to add also, you have to take it seriously, and literally, and come up with the same exact conclusions that Ken Ham has come up with.
The correct conclusions.
Right.
Right. That's what fundamentalism is all about.
Yeah.
It's not that the Bible is inerrant. It's that my interpretation of the Bible is inerrant.
So this is an association of fundamentalism, where you've got Genesis 1 fundamentalists meeting up with, in some case, well, I won't say race fundamentalists, but Stephen Wolfe's podcast partner did get fired from his job because he was revealed to be a closet white supremacist and was tweeting under a false name, fairly racist tweets. But Stephen Wolfe isn't. He will say he's not a kinist. I'm not a kinist. I just prefer my own people, and so should you.
Hey, this is probably an appropriate time to plug the fact that this week we have a brand new HOLYPOST explainer video coming out.
What is it?
It's called, I think the title is The Real Problem with Christian Nationalism.
Oh, man. Who made it?
We made it.
Who's in
but
it?
I'm in it. I'm in it.
Sky. Wow.
And so if you haven't seen it yet, it should be on the HOLYPOST website or on our YouTube channel.
Oh,
or the social
like
mediums.
when this comes out on Wednesday? Oh, I'll have to tweet about it. Ooh, I'll send it to Ken Ham so he can get mad at me again and talk about me on his podcast, so that people come to my sites and say angry things because I'm a Genesis denier. Oh, dear. Okay, let's go to Ryan Burge. He's a HOLYPOST pundit. He always comes up with interesting data. And this is a conclusion. He wrote about this a few weeks ago. I've had the story kind of in my bag, my story bag. We actually do have a story bag at HOLYPOST, but it's not a literal bag because we're not fundamentalist bag people. Church attendance used to drive up trust. It doesn't anymore. Ooh. That's a little bit scary. Okay, religion is a net positive only when people actively engage in all the aspects of religious life, including regular corporate worship. There are tons of examples of how it seems engaging in regular corporate worship seems to improve mental health, generates feelings of tolerance, and provides opportunities for people to volunteer in their communities. There's another area in which religious attendance has been demonstrated to generate positive outcomes, and that's interpersonal trust. Scholars define interpersonal trust as the confidence in another person or between two persons, the confidence in another person and a willingness to be vulnerable to him or her. So I'm willing to be vulnerable with you. I have confidence that you're not going to take advantage of me. Okay, so the General Social Survey, that's the big survey the country takes every year, every couple of years, and has for a very long time. They pose the question, generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted or that you can't be too careful in dealing with people? Which one are you more likely to agree with? And then you can also say, it depends. In some situations, I need to know the situation. In the early 70s, a majority, a bare majority, a tiny majority, 51% of Americans said you can't be too careful. About 45% said other people can be trusted. So it was almost evenly split in the early 1970s. By the year 2000, 60% of respondents said others can't be trusted, up from 51 in 1970. When they measured it in 2022, it was up to 65% chose the distrust option. Only 26 said people could be trusted, and 9% said it depends on the circumstances. Now, Ryan dives into this deeper and says, okay, let's look, this is where it gets interesting, let's look at political partisanship. In the 1970s, Democrats were significantly less trusting of others compared to Republicans during the same period. But that has changed between the 1970s and today. Democrats are actually less trusting they were in 1970s, but not nearly as less trusting as Republicans have become. And Republicans have now passed Democrats on the race to be the least trusting party. Now 65% of Republicans don't trust other people, while just 28% of them say others can be trusted. Democrats, it's 57% and 31%. Okay, the most reliable predictor of how much you trust other people or mistrust other people, though, isn't political party, it's education level. The more education you have attained, the more likely you are to say you trust other people. And some people say it's because you're just going through the process of getting lots of education, you're relying on a lot of people that come from different backgrounds, so maybe you just have more exposure to other people. Maybe.
So I was wondering, does he give any hypotheses as to why more education leads to more trust? Because it's a little bit like the research that says the more educated people are, the more likely they are to believe in God and be educated, where your instinct is the opposite. Yeah. It tends to, our assumption is that people who are ignorant and uneducated believe in God, and the super educated don't. But it's the opposite. Same here.
Here's another way to look at it, and this is a change from the 1950s or 1960s. If you're very educated, are you more likely to live around other very educated people? And are you more likely to live in a relatively safe community?
And probably a diverse community.
Yeah, a neighborhood where you don't have to worry all the time that someone's going to break into your house. You don't have to worry all the time that the guy coming to your door has, bad intentions. So I think the more as we've segregated ourselves by communities, and it's much less about race now than it is about education. Upper-class, well-educated people tend to live around other upper-class, well-educated people, go to church with other upper-class, well-educated people. So education appears to be, and much of the growth in distrust is happening at the lower end of the educational spectrum. So distrust has grown radically among people with low levels of education. Okay, now we get to the religious part, because, and this is what Ryan Burge studies in particular, What's more interesting is that as a Christian, attendance, regular, like weekly or semi-weekly attendance of a church service was a marker for increased interpersonal trust. You are more likely to say you can generally trust the people around you if you go to church relatively often. That changed around 2010. And since 2010, you no longer see a trust benefit from regular church attendance. In fact, in some cases, you now see a slight trust deficit from regular church attendance.
Thanks, Obama.
The line for the 2010 decade pointed downward. Religious attendance used to clearly drive up interpersonal trust by about 5%. From the bottom of the attendance spectrum to the top. Now overall trust seems to decline just a bit from the bottom of the attendance spectrum just to the top. So, and this is Ryan Burge's theory. He says, simply stated, church used to be a great way to interact with folks who were different than you. They voted for a different candidate. They came from a different economic background. Folks with doctorates sitting next to folks with a high school diploma. That offers a tremendous amount of opportunities to learn about other people. But houses of worship have more and more become monocultures. Churches, synagogues, and mosques are full of educated middle-class folks who did everything right. There isn't a whole lot of mixing anymore on a Sunday morning. So we've kind of done the same thing where we're not exposing ourselves to radically different people and not getting to know people, from different backgrounds, even in church. Because we've resegregated our church along the same lines that we've resegregated our communities.
I wonder if part of it is also, more Americans, I think, are attending larger churches than in the past, even though the average size is still whatever it is. There's a lot more mega churches than there used to be in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. And in a lot of those places, even if there's diversity in the ranks of the congregation, you're kind of anonymous. You don't actually go and build connections and relationships. You don't linger over the donut holes in the foyer, So you don't get the same relational development that you would in a congregation of 100 or 200. Right. So I wonder if that's a factor.
Well, isn't church attendance down in general anyway?
Yeah,
I mean,
it is.
Commitment and involvement and going to church and making relationships and being in community, that's all
he's looking at people, he's just looking at people who do still attend. They're saying that they are also not as trusting as they used to be. So there's something that's changed in the nature of church that no longer fosters trust between people.
And I think part of it, I'm going to theorize, may also be, which we've talked about 150 times over the last 10 years, being more discipled by your media intake than by your pastor.
Right.
And social media, privileges content that generates a very strong emotional response. And the easiest way to do that is to make you scared of the people around you, of those people over there that are coming to take my things. And whether it's at the border or in the big city or whatever it is, we're really good now at weaponizing demonization, and say, you got to watch out for those people. I mean, who on both sides, we now have people saying the other side is trying to ruin America. The other side, which side are you on? That's not relevant. Both sides say the other side is trying to ruin America. So do you trust them? Are you nuts? They're trying to ruin America. Did you not hear what I just said? They're trying to ruin America. So if everyone thinks the other guys, even in my own neighborhood, if they have the wrong yard sign, are trying to ruin America, what does that do to social trust?
Yeah, there was another study, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I've cited it a couple times. Gallup back in the 1960s asked Americans, would you be okay if your adult son or daughter married somebody from the opposite political party? And the majority of Americans were fine with it. They didn't care. And today it's the opposite.
No way, man.
Right. It would be devastating. And it's largely because we believe that people from the other political identity are evil. Yeah. They're not just mistaken or wrong or flawed in their values or mistaken in their priorities. They're flat out evil. And so we have so internalized these political identities, and then we carry them into our churches, and we expect our congregations to be filled with people not who are all equally committed to Jesus Christ, but who are all equally committed to my political ideology. And if they're not, well, then they can't be a genuine Christian either. So then we get these monolithic homogenous congregations where we can't build social trust because everyone's exactly like us. Why wouldn't we trust them already?
Right. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say this dynamic, I'm going to go back to our story at the Ark experience and say this dynamic is also driving Christian nationalism in America because we no longer trust that our neighbors will do the right thing. So we need the power to force them to do the right thing. And so the anti-democratic drive within parts of the Republican Party and the Christian nationalist movement, and it is an anti-democratic movement, is largely because we're sick of people. We think they're demons and they're trying to ruin everything and take our children away so they can't have the right to vote. So we have an anti-democratic movement because of the loss of social trust. Thank you. Thank you and good night. I solved it.
I want to take it back to the rat lung story.
Really?
The worms.
Really?
Yeah.
You want to go back that far?
You see, the political polarization and identity kind of demonization started as a media thing, just like the worms start in the rat. And it was a way for the media to drum up attention and get it. And then it gets excreted by the media, and it's supposed to get eaten by
slugs,
political parties, the slugs, the political parties, the politicos, all the people in the kind of the pundits in the political world, and then it just gets recycled back to the rats.
Yeah.
But somewhere along the line, instead of getting ingested by the slugs, it got eaten by the church. And now the church has been infected with this polarization and this lack of trust and this demonization of people that are different, and we are going insane with worms in the brain.
Wow. So
I love that. That's
social
so true.
media is rat poop. Is that what you're saying?
Basically.
And we're not supposed
worm
to be
infested
eating
rat
it.
poop.
It's supposed to be discarded. Okay, Christian, what can we do about this? What can we do? I'm sure you have some really good ideas.
You're asking me this question? Oh, Phil.
How do you learn to trust your neighbors?
You get to know your neighbors.
If you don't want to do that.
Especially ones.
If I don't want to know my neighbors, how do I learn how to trust my neighbors?
Well, truthfully, it begins with personal responsibility. I mean, I think it's understanding this concept that we're discussing and looking at ourselves and saying, am I this? You know, starting with sort of the plank in our own eyes. Does this apply to me? And if this applies to me, how can I change this, and live a different example? And it's got to start with us, because the finger pointing of, hey, you over there, you're doing this and you got to stop it, is exactly what we're just railing against. So it comes, I think it comes down to personal responsibility and making sure that we are aligned with Christ and what he calls us to be. And those in our sphere of influence. That's, it's got to be in our families and those we are around, I think.
I hear you.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying, Christian, is rather than just asking, how can I learn to trust my neighbor? It's asking, am I a trustworthy neighbor? And I think about my wife, like she's far better at this than I am, of actually building relationships and serving the people around us. And people trust her because she's earned their trust. And then it's like a good kind of contagion where that spreads in a community or in a neighborhood or whatever. But I think you're right. It's on us as Christians to serve first and care first and prove that we are reliable.
You really got to attend Kelly Johnson's 50th birthday because she trusts your wife.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, so that's
100%. Yeah.
So if we're not very trustworthy, we at least need to marry someone who's very trustworthy so we can get invited on trips. Kristen.
I really do think that, Sky, you've said it so eloquently. You're really onto something, because it's not just like self-analyzing and saying, okay, am I living the way that I should live? There is a point where we have to act, and you're right. Like reaching out to those people that we don't agree with or that are not like us, that aren't in the same political party, and actually loving and serving them so they get to know someone who is different. That's a huge step. And we have to take it. We can't just intellectually think about it.
Can't I just podcast about it?
Well, Phil, that is a start for you. So that'll be all right.
Thank you. Thank you for not immediately smacking me upside the head, for letting me down gently. Okay, everybody, thanks for listening. If you're at the Ark Encounter and you happen to notice people marching around with Christian nationalist flags, take a picture, let us know. Reach out to them. Hug them. Tell them they can trust you with their bad theology. Anywho, thanks for listening. New stuff coming up. Russell Moore, Why I'm Still a Christian, came out last Monday. Sky's video on Christian nationalism is probably out by the time you listen to this. There's more Christian Ask stuff. We got more Caitlin School's Sky stuff coming up, including one about Taylor Swift, the theology of Taylor Swift. I can't wait to hear that. And we're just having tons of fun, and we can only do it because you guys support us. So thanks so much for doing it. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Today's episode is sponsored by Blueland. Hey, we throw away a lot of plastic, an estimated 5 billion plastic hand soap and cleaning product bottles a year, and that ain't good for God's green earth. Blueland can help. They're on a mission to eliminate single-use plastics by offering endlessly refillable cleaning products with a beautiful design that looks great on your counter. Fill the bottles with water, drop in Blueland tablets, and wait for them to dissolve. You'll never ever have to buy giant plastic bottles of cleaning supplies again. Let's stop messing up this beautiful planet God made. You can get cleaning sprays, hand soap, toilet bowl cleaner, laundry tablets. Blueland products are made with clean ingredients you can feel good about. And Blueland has a special offer for HOLYPOST listeners. Right now, you can get 15% off your first order by going to blueland.com/HOLYPOST. You won't want to miss this. Blueland.com/HOLYPOST for 15% off. That's blueland.com/HOLYPOST to get 15% off. And thanks to Blueland for sponsoring this episode. This episode is sponsored by Moody Publishers, who have a new book from our buddy, Drew Dyck. We love Drew Dyck. Who doesn't love Drew Dyck? He's thoughtful, he's funny, he's Canadian. He's a regular guest on the HOLYPOST and the author of the new book, Just Show Up, A Guide for Exhausted Christians. Growing up in the evangelical church, I heard the message over and over that God had big, amazing things in mind for me to do. Our culture tells us we're brilliant and awesome and powerful and capable of anything. Yet most of us, me included, feel like the best we can do half the time is just get ourselves out of bed and show up at work with matching socks. Thankfully, God doesn't expect us to do everything. Simply showing up is often the most important thing. With his signature humor and candor, Drew writes about his own messy life while telling inspiring stories of how God rewards the persistent presence of ordinary people, just like you and me. Pick up your copy of Just Show Up today at moodypublishers.com or wherever you buy books. And thanks to Moody Publishers for sponsoring this episode.
We've been seeing battles in the news recently over the teaching of history in public schools. Florida's controversial new curriculum is being accused of diminishing the evil of slavery by saying some enslaved people actually benefited from the skills they learned. And the Texas state legislature tried banning the teaching of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech in public schools because it might make white children feel guilty. These fights over history are important because whoever defines the past has enormous power to control the present. That truth is not lost on today's guest. Jasmine Holmes is a writer and teacher who's probably best known for teaching overlooked but important bits of history on Instagram, and she gives a special focus to the Black experience in America. Her latest book is Crowned with Glory: How Proclaiming the Truth of Black Dignity Has Shaped American History. With so many people tempted to abandon their Christian faith because of the racism and misogyny that's prevalent in a lot of evangelical history, Holmes says we should look at the stories of those Christians who are on the margins, the enslaved, the poor, the women, and the minorities, whose faith in Christ can still inspire us today. Caitlin spoke with Jasmine Holmes about her new book, and in this conversation they explore some of the stories of these remarkable but overlooked Christians. Here's her conversation with Jasmine Holmes.
Jasmine, thank you so much for doing this. I was telling you a minute ago, I'm like a big fan of yours, and I'm just really excited to talk about this new book, Crowned with Glory: How Proclaiming the Truth of Black Dignity Has Shaped American History. It's so wonderful, and I'm really excited that hopefully this conversation will provoke some people to buy it because I have just really enjoyed it. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start out with, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, especially as it relates to your interest in history and your study of history? I think probably some people know you from all of the education that you provide on Instagram, but you start the book with a little bit of your background, even teaching students in a classroom, and kind of your passion for history and education for purposes outside of itself as well, for really furthering justice seeking and people having a stronger sense of their own dignity, as the subtitle suggests. So could you just tell us a little bit about you and how you came to do this kind of work?
Absolutely. I've been a teacher or I was a teacher for 9 years, just right out of college, started teaching middle school. I was an English major who taught history and English, and I left the classroom in 2021. And I'm currently in grad school studying history, and everybody in one of my classes is also either a teacher or used to be a teacher. And
Wow.
just a lot of us have left the classroom or are contemplating leaving the classroom or are feeling conflicted about staying in the classroom because of all of the pushback that has been going on nationally about history and teaching certain things. And so it was a really interesting conversation. I don't think I realized until last night we were all sitting in class and all of us had education backgrounds and all of us were feeling just really conflicted about either the people who are there or the people who are not there anymore.
Yeah. And how did you end up in the place that you are in terms of using social media to talk about this? Because I have often pointed people to your Instagram just because you offer so many resources to people who I think didn't learn this history in school or, have questions about it. So how did you end up feeling like that was something that you should do?
Well, when I started my Instagram in 2019, it was because my publisher at the time was like, oh, well, are you using your Instagram to to promote your book? And so I was like, all right, well, I'll make a new Instagram. I'll make a public Instagram and I'll just start sharing. And it was back when you had to have 10,000 followers to get the swipe up to share. And so I was like, I really need 10,000 followers so that I can swipe, so I can have the swipe up option. I need to swipe up and show you guys these sources. And so it's been like a slow and steady growing over the last few years, but it really was just an outpouring of me being really excited about the things that I was researching as I was writing, and sharing them, and then being surprised that people actually were interested in what I was sharing, and people were being helped and aided. And I really think, at that time I was still in the classroom. I hadn't decided to go back to school. It was really just a passion of mine that I was pursuing, with publishers who were happy to give me a chance writing these things. And it just blossomed from there.
And was there a point in your own education where you kind of thought, oh, I haven't been taught the things that I wish that I had been taught? Or was there a moment when you thought, oh, history in particular is really important? It's not just like dry information. Because I even imagine some people listening, I feel like I'm the one on the podcast a lot of the time being like, let's talk about the history. But I feel like I really have to convince people sometimes that it does have great importance to how we think about ourselves and the work in the world that we're doing now. Did you have a moment when you were like, oh, I love this? Or even I think it's important for me to learn some things that I didn't learn in the past?
Absolutely. I had a couple of pivotal moments. I will say one was in 2016, right after my son was born. We were living in Minnesota, and we were living in the neighborhood, or we were just about to move out of the neighborhood where Philando Castile was murdered. And I had a newborn baby. He was less than a month old, and my husband was out running an errand, and I logged onto Facebook and saw the end of the broadcast and was just really, I had seen so many things, and I feel like in one sense we become so desensitized to watching these videos of violence and hearing these stories of violence. But it was almost like I couldn't insulate myself from it with the combination of the postpartum hormones and my husband being out, and it happened in the neighborhood where we lived, and I just had a brand new son. It all just kind of came crashing down. And then just a few days later, the video of Eric Garner's death in New York showed. And so I think that was a point in my life where I was like, oh, I have always been a person who prided myself in that mentality of, well, we'll just wait for the facts. We have to hear both sides. It's a
Yeah.
really complex issue. I'd always taken a lot of pride in that. And this was the first time that I wasn't able to. I always think about like 1984, that double think, where you have a thought and you have a visceral reaction, but you can immediately follow it up with, no, this is what I'm supposed to think about this.
Yeah.
It didn't work. And so that was one of the first moments. And then a second one was a mentor of mine. And I had a really tough conversation about history. And they kind of had these canned answers that I had learned in my education. And it was one of the first moments in my life where I was like, that's not enough. But I don't have the words to say why it's not enough. And I don't have the understanding to say why it's not enough. And I need to figure it out. So I would say, that 2016, 2017, I just started, you can tell by my Amazon history, I just started buying so many books and trying to understand everything, really.
And I think there's probably people listening who, in a different way, they don't share your exact story, but that does feel like a period where they suddenly were like, I need to learn some history. Like, I haven't been taught a full or accurate history of the country that I belong to. And now I'm seeing effects of things that don't just seem isolated. They seem related to all this history, but I don't know a lot of it. What prompted you to write this book in particular? Because I think a lot of people have read a lot of stories of abuse and suffering and racial injustice in our country. And I don't know that many of the books people have gone to have highlighted the way this book does, like the truth of Black dignity in your subtitle. A lot of the stories, especially that a lot of white people have consumed, have not really highlighted the agency of Black people in American history, or even there were so many moments in this where I thought like, oh, you've described real joy in someone or hope in ways that I don't know some of those histories people have read have done. Was that a goal of the book, or how did you think about all of the complications of these stories and bringing them into this book?
Yeah, this book, so I wrote a book in 2021 called not me forgetting the name of my own book, Carved with Ebony. I was like, it's not Carved with Ebony, this is Crowned with Glory.
Which people should read Carved in Ebony. Oh gosh, now I'm doing it. Carved in Ebony as well. It's also wonderful.
Thank you so much. But it's about 10 Black women from American history. And I love that the book focused on women. I had so much fun writing about these 10 women. It was so hard to narrow it down to just 10. And after I wrote it and after it was published and everything, it just, so many of the things that I had read just wouldn't leave me alone. In particular, David Walker's appeal. And as I think, I still have more to say. I still have more to share. And I totally agree. I think a lot of the books that talk about, I want to be careful because there is a sense in which I'm so glad for all of the books that exist that are calling American evangelicalism to the map for its complicity in white supremacy. I'm so grateful for that. And I don't think that we need less of that. But what I'd also like to see more of in addition is the understanding that while white supremacy has defined a really big subset of American Christianity, it's not the only story of American Christianity, and it's not the only story of American faith in practice. And if we kind of turn our lens towards the marginalized, towards the oppressed, we see a different story. We see a more robust story of faith and perseverance and acknowledgement of dignity. And so I think, that two-pronged approach of, yes, holding the church accountable, but also celebrating the people who truly lived in the spirit of the church that we've been called to be is really important. And I think that it's also important that those people not all be kind of these white savior figures that we normally think about when we think about abolitionists or normally think about when we think about activists, but people from the marginalized group that's being abused as well, having a voice, and the ways in which they use their voices. I definitely did not know as a student myself, and as somebody who I would have told you that I loved history, did not realize the chorus of Black Christian voices that were adamantly, loudly, articulately against slavery.
Yeah, I had not read David Walker's Appeal until probably a little over a year ago, doing research for my book on the Bible and American history, because he uses scripture so much. And I was sort of angry that I had never heard of this like just incredible text and person. And I wanted to talk to you about this first chapter where you're talking about Nat Turner and David Walker, and especially, I mean, anyone who listens to this podcast will not be surprised that I'm most curious about the way that the Bible is used in some of these. But I found this first chapter so moving in that you have this repeated reference to the language Jeremiah uses of peace, peace when there is no peace, which I thought was so helpful, not only because I feel like I hear that a lot now, you know, in social media in response to various political issues.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about that passage as it relates to Nat Turner, and you talk a little bit about Patrick Henry, which that combination I thought was so helpful to highlight what we kind of elevate historically and the like biblical references we go to when we think of like a Christian America versus references that were well known by Black activists and intellectuals and everyday people at the time.
Yeah. It's so interesting when I read Patrick Henry's speech and I was like, wait, this is Jeremiah too. That's so fascinating. It's, you know, the juxtaposition of Patrick Henry seeing himself as victimized by the British and not wanting to be enslaved and not wanting to be treated as less than human in his mind, was almost the exact same language that David Walker was using in his appeal. And one thing that I loved learning about as I was writing my last book was about the African American Jeremiad, and just the tradition of the Jeremiad and the tradition of calling the culture that we are involved in, that we are a part of, to account for not living up to what God has called us to be and for not living up to what God has called us to do. And it fits so well into the culture of Black church and Black activism. And so many of us, we know what a Jeremiad is, even if we don't know the language. We've heard an MLK speech that was definitely a Jeremiad before. But there's this huge like pattern of the Jeremiad coming up over and over and over again in so many of these speeches and in so many of these diatribes and in so many of these protests, because ultimately, I think in order for Black Christians to reconcile their faith with the faith that was professed by their oppressors, there had to be an understanding that somebody here is a hypocrite. Yeah. Somebody here is not telling the truth. Somebody here is saying that they're one thing and they're doing another thing. And it's so similar to Jeremiah's call to Israel of like, okay, you're saying that you're God's promised nation and, you know, you're supposed to be really different, but you're doing all these things that are exactly the same as the people around you, including oppressing others, which Jeremiah talks about over and over and over again. And so I think of people like David Walker who were able to actually read the Bible and who were able to actually be literate, and who were able to unpack all those things. But then you also think of just the power of the Holy Spirit in these lives of Black enslaved Christians who were not allowed to learn how to read the Bible, who were not allowed to gather for worship, a lot of times, who were not allowed to, you know, profess. I mean, there's stories of people being sold because they kept preaching the gospel in the fields and it was like, you got to work, you got to go. So even without access to the Bible, even without the access to the written word of the Bible, the idea of the Jeremiad, the idea of calling out oppression, the idea of serving a freedom-loving God was still present in these folks. And honestly, I don't have any explanation for that aside from the power of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, I love the line in the appeal where David Walker says, like, they have the Bible in their hands. Do they believe it? No, they don't. Like, their actions have witnessed to us that they don't believe the words of the Bible. And you have a section later in the book where you're talking about this question of literacy and denying enslaved people and sometimes free Black people literacy for the purpose partially of keeping them from accessing scripture, which I think is so interesting because people tend to go to, when they think about the Bible and slavery, they go to the passages that white enslaving or just slavery supporting white people were using, and they think, okay, the Bible is this oppressive thing used against enslaved people. And that doesn't make sense of the fact that clearly, at least some people thought some of this stuff is too dangerous or radical for you to have access to. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I really think that's a part of the history that, again, in our very legitimate uncovering of the way some passages in Paul and, you know, Abraham's owning slaves have been used against people made in the image of God, there's also this other stuff that I don't know that we talk about very often.
There's so much conversation going on during the abolitionists, kind of like there's abolitionists from the beginning, but their heyday, their period of just like pedal to the metal, 1830s, they were like, something's got to give. And there's so much conversation there where there's these abolitionists who were talking about man stealing, and they're talking about the verse in Exodus where whoever steals a man shall be put to death. And it's, you have taken people from where they were, brought them over to a new place, and then you are perpetuating their enslavement generation after generation after generation, which is something that in its exact form hadn't existed in a bunch of places around the world yet. Now, slavery is a tale as old as time. Everybody will tell you that, and it's totally true. But American chattel slavery was this really unique institution in that the idea of race was so tied to slavery, and in that the idea of race was something that could pollute. So what I mean by that is, in America, the quote unquote one drop rule in regards to Black people is literally something that was on the law books. Like if you have a great grandparent who's Black, you're Black. It doesn't matter if everybody else in your family is white, you're Black. And that's that idea of pollution, that idea of impurity, that idea that's just solidified in the idea that there's a class of people who were supposed to be in bondage, and there's a class of people who are supposed to rule over them. And so I think even when we're grappling with the idea of slavery in Scripture and the idea of bondage in Scripture, it's really important not to read our own like cultural understanding into what was going on in the Scripture. It's also really important to see what God actually commands and what God actually makes provision for. And I think that gets a little bit confused sometimes, and I get it. I mean, when I'm reading Leviticus, my husband was listening to Leviticus this morning, and I was like, okay.
Yes.
I get why we're having hangups and why we're kind of like, what does this mean? But really, I mean, understanding God's ideal versus the provisions that God made for Israel while they were living in certain places and in certain ways, it just doesn't jive with the idea of slavery. And at the time that slavery was going on, people knew this. Like, they understood this. It's not as though they were like, oh my gosh, what? The Bible doesn't like the Bible doesn't like the way that we're treating these people. That's crazy. No, it's just that they thought it's a necessary evil, and what else are we going to do? And it's just is what it is. And it's our, they called it the peculiar institution. Like, it's this cute little thing that we have.
Yeah. And that the thing you said at the beginning there about, Scripture has something to say about stealing people and enslaving them through generations. I also so appreciated the part of the book, the chapter of the book where you're talking about gender and family and how that all relates, because that was something that surprised me when I was doing research in this period, was like, oh, how often that was an argument to say you really value the family, you say you value parenting and motherhood, but you're ripping families apart. But the other part of that chapter that I think might be even more new to people is you start off talking about the cult of true womanhood and the way that early American ideas about gender and femininity were both denied to Black women, but also still used against them. And I think this part is surprising to some people, in part because the way we tell the story of American history, especially when it comes to some of these questions, is like, there's a story about gender we can tell, and then there's a separate story about race we can tell, and we act like those are not related or overlapping stories. Can you tell us a little bit about some of that background of how those ideas played out? And especially, I think what's so striking to me about that chapter is how you identified Black women writing within those kind of norms, but also really using them to their advantage.
I feel like it's kind of like it is now, where there's an ideal woman. We all know our own idea of what the ideal woman looks like. Does that mean that every woman in our culture, or even most women in our culture, live up to that ideal woman? No. But that ideal woman tells us something about our culture. It tells us that we prize thinness. It tells us that we prize success. It tells us that we prize a certain type of desirability. And so just as that's true now, back in the 19th century, you had this ideal woman. Were most of the women in the U.S. living up to that ideal? No. Most of them didn't make enough money to live up to that ideal. They were working in factories, or they were working on farms. But that doesn't shake the idea that the ideal was a woman of leisure, a woman who could look over her home, look over her servants in the North, enslaved folks in the South, and who was a domestic engineer, who was soft-spoken, who was feminine. There's even this thing called consumptive chic. Because
That was the wildest part of this chapter to me. I was like, what?
I found out about it. It was like a new thing for me that I started reading about last year like crazy. But just the idea of beauty that's tied to tuberculosis, because only sensitive people get tuberculosis, and it makes you lose weight, and it makes your cheeks really sallow, but it makes them really rosy too, and it's like a really romantic disease.
Oh man.
So even like the idea of femininity is so pathologized that a deadly illness is something that's like desirable in a way. And so you have that over there, and sure, you have these working class white women who are never going to fit into this ideology, but you have, maybe through marriage, or maybe through a certain level of social climbing, or maybe through a certain level of, effort, they could attain some of it. Then you have Black women who can't attain any of it ever, because one of the hallmarks of the idea is that the woman be white. That white womanhood is something that's worthy of being defended. That white femininity is something worthy to be prized. The idea of white female sexuality being something that in the period that we're not talking about, okay? We're not even showing our ankles. We're not even showing our wrists. And yet we talk about Black women as breeding women, as women who can have enough children to make them worthy of spending more money on them on the auction block so that they can bring more children every year. We have white women, carried away from men in society, right? They're not like in the same rooms. They're not in the same places. There's these feminine, locales and this feminine area of life. And then you have Black women and Black men who are working alongside each other in the field, in the exact same locale, the exact same location. And there's so many of those little things that amount to really big things about what we think about femininity and what we think about what is worthy of protection. And even when you have Black women in the North, even when you have free Black women, you still have artists who are rendering them in really offensive ways in comics and the newspaper, who are basically saying you guys are trying so hard to be so feminine, and it's laughable. It's laughable that you think that you could attain the level of femininity. They dealt with so much mockery. And then also just the sheer fact that many times Black men in the North were not able to make as much money as their white counterparts because of disparities of pay. And so Black women in the North were working. They were working to support their husbands. Frederick Douglass is his wife. Anna Marie Douglass, she worked and supported him. And a lot of abolitionist wives that were home worked and supported their husbands because abolitionist work was not paying the bills. And so you have this dichotomy of this is what we idealize a woman to be, and this is the most that Black women, even of a certain class, can aspire to. There's a story in the book about Margaretta Fortin, whose father was extremely wealthy. She was extremely well educated. She fit the exact prototype of what you would think a lady of the period would be, but she was a Black woman. And because of the fact that she was a Black woman, no matter how impressive she was, she and her sisters always spoke to that feeling of being perceived as less than and being treated as less than.
That's such a helpful description, Jasmine. Like I said, I think we too often pretend like gender and race dynamics are not constantly, in our history at least, just completely inextricably combined. And it reminds me too, there's so many women in this book that I want to talk about, or even in your other book. I've told you before, Mariah Stewart, I just have loved reading, and we could just talk about her for forever. But I'm really curious. I think what would be really helpful for you is to tell us about Elizabeth Key Grinstead, because I think her story really reveals something to us about thinking about the relationship between religion and race in America. And even that story, I think some people might be familiar with kind of the concept at play here, but I had never really thought much about this particular person and how this related to these larger dynamics, but really played out in her particular life. So can you tell us a little bit about her?
Elizabeth Key Grinstead was enslaved in the colonies in the 1800s, or no, in the 18th century, 17th century.
I always mix up the
1600s. late 1600s, whatever that is. And she sued for her freedom because, number one, she was only supposed to be an indentured servant. She was not supposed to be enslaved for life. And it's still this period of time in America where slavery has not been completely systematized. It hasn't been, it hasn't been eradicated in the North. It's not the juggernaut that it would be in the South yet. And so at this pivotal moment in history, she's like, hey, I was just supposed to be an indentured servant. I wasn't supposed to be enslaved for life. Number two, my father is a white man, and we don't have legislation yet that says that if a Black woman has a baby, then that baby, regardless of who their father is also Black and therefore also enslaved. We don't have that legislation yet. Mm-hmm. So my dad is a white man, and my condition should be whatever his condition is. And then thirdly, I've been baptized. I'm a Christian, and you can't enslave another Christian. And it's something that Catherine Gerbner talks about in the book Christian Slavery, and she does a much more thorough job than what I was able to do in these few pages. But the fact that early on in American history, one of the biggest excuses that was made for chattel slavery was, okay, we're Christian, they're heathen. That's why we're allowed to treat them this way, and that's why we're allowed to enslave them. Then you had this kind of catch-22 of like, okay, we're supposed to be giving the gospel to the heathens, right? But we can't give the gospel to the heathens, because if we do, then that means we have to free our property. And so there was kind of a little back and forth early on in colonial history where, magistrates were sending out like PSAs like, hey, don't worry, you can give your slave the gospel and baptize them. That doesn't mean they're free. It's fine. You can still do it. And so then slavery had to kind of start being based on something other than Protestant supremacy. And Catherine Gerbner argues that it came to be based in white supremacy. And so even if your enslaved property becomes a Christian, well, they're still Black. And so they're still not as worth as much as you are. But Elizabeth's story just sits at the cross section of so much change in America. I mean, the way that we conceptualize slavery as it came to be in the 1800s was really not Elizabeth's experience in the 1600s. It had not become this widespread practice with millions of people and this systematized practice where you're trying to have these Black families have as many children as possible so that you can have as much property as possible. And it hasn't become that yet. It's not become this thing where it's just not become the thing that it would be. And so she was able to sue successfully and gain her freedom. And she married a white man, and she lived out the rest of her days in freedom. And just in 50 years after she lived, that would not have been legislatively possible south of the Dixon line. So it's just this rapid change that was going on. And Elizabeth just happened to be born right at a time before that rapid change made her freedom impossible.
Wow, I just think that's so helpful for people to, again, think about that this is not like an historical inevitability that things worked out this way. Like, people made choices along the way to justify their financial interests and their desire for power. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I just really love at the very end of your book, you're kind of giving an afterword, which I appreciate. You're like, I'm sorry that I mostly gave you long quotes, but I really want this history to speak for itself, which I appreciate. And then you say at the end, I'm just going to read this because I think it's really beautiful. You say, finally, as a Christian, it's very important for me to communicate that the saving faith of Christ has always borne fruit in this country. But when modern day Christians are constantly looking for that fruit in the lives of enslavers and oppressors, they are shaking the wrong trees. The gospel fruit borne by those who stood against the widespread practice of chattel slavery is far sweeter, and its evidence is abundantly clear in the testimonies these men and women left behind. We just haven't been looking for them. I feel like a lot of the people who listen to this podcast and a lot of the people I talk to are really just entirely disillusioned and exhausted with Christianity in general, maybe, but especially Christianity in America, for good reason. Like, they have become aware that the faith that they inherited, especially white evangelical Christians, isn't this like unbroken trajectory of like goodness and faithfulness. And they're understandably really heartbroken about all of that. And like we said before, that's important. And the like repentance and lament that comes with that is really important. But I also think sometimes white Christians who are really exhausted by that and disillusioned by that still are keeping their focus pretty exclusively on other white Christians when they are just completely done with Christianity in America. And so I so appreciate your call to like, let's look at other stories. There are other stories that have borne real fruit. What about this history in particular gives you hope when you're reading it? For not only just kind of looking back and seeing examples of faithfulness, but do you think it teaches us anything, maybe even for people who are like, I kind of don't know what goodness there is. I'm glad to hear there were some faithful Christians, but I still am struggling to find any reason to continue going to scripture or the church or participating in any of that.
It's one of those things that is such a personal journey towards our understanding of Christ and his church and the ways that Christ and his church have been mishandled and utilized in ways that Christ never intended his church to be utilized. Mm-hmm. And so I totally understand people's desire to just kind of turn away, to kind of walk away. So I'll speak for myself personally.
Yeah.
When learning about the Christians that I profiled in this book, and when learning about the Christians who were enslaved and the ways in which the persecuted enslaved church thrived in spite of that persecution and the way that they met anyway. And there's so many stories of whippings and beatings and being sold and being abused for refusing to stop praying for freedom specifically. And for me, I had to decide who was writing the narrative. Was my heritage the heritage of steadfast Christians in the plantations who continued to pray for freedom and trust God for that freedom, and whose trust in God led them to act and claim that freedom for themselves? Or was my Christian heritage going to be defined by the people who were in the big house enslaving these other people and saying all the right things on Sunday, but living like hell in the fields the rest of the week? And for me, it really came down to my faith is, first of all, my faith is defined by Christ, but we do want to see the trajectory. History matters, right? And so finding this unbroken chain that you talked about, I think we have to follow it to different places. I think it's not always in the places that we're going to be expecting to see it. And I think that even that says something amazing about God. I think even that says something amazing about Christ and the way that he works. And I think that I cannot turn away from the faith that brought so many to freedom. I cannot turn away from the faith that brought so much justice to light. And that's, again, me personally. Everybody has a personal way of grappling with and understanding. But that's the way that I have come to understand and the way that I have come to see the strength of my faith, not to see it as a weakness. Because as a Black woman, there's this narrative that Christianity was beat into the enslaved, that they were forced to believe in God, that they were forced to, believe in Christ, they were forced to be baptized. And honestly, so many times it was the exact opposite. So many times Christianity and the sacraments were withheld from the enslaved. And so for them to see it as something precious in spite of that, and for them to differentiate between the faith that they had and the faith of their enslavers, that's really powerful. And I cannot turn my back on that. Do not want to turn my back on that, because it shows me so much about God and so much about Christ and so much about embodiment and so much about his goodness and so much about his justice as well. And so, that's how I've grappled with it, how I continue to grapple with it. Being in grad school is so fun because my advisor read this book and he was like, it was really good. I really liked it. I was like, oh, thank you so much. And he goes, you're really religious. And I was like, I am really religious. I said, but I try not to bring it, too much into my academic writing unless it's on topic.
It's there, yeah.
Right. And he goes, I think that you should. I think that that's a big part of you, and I think that that's a big part of why you do this. And honestly, it really is. It's a big part of why I do this work and why these stories matter so much to me is because I am very religious.
Yeah.
and have become more religious in learning about the religions of those who've gone before me.
That's such a good last line, Jasmine, because I do think it's true that even the lines that I was reading, I think some people have heard what you just said in their churches, like, yeah, learn from these Christians and get inspired by their faith. But the examples that were held up to them are people that they then discover are sometimes entirely unworthy of modeling our faith after. But there are Christians in these pages that you have written that I think are worthy of all of us to sit at their feet and learn from. So thank you for the work that you've done. Again, the book is called Crowned with Glory. I really cannot highly recommend it enough, especially if the last few years you have felt like, oh gosh, there is so much history I did not learn. Jasmine has done hard work. You don't have to do all the hard work that she did. You can benefit from the fruit of her labor. So thank you for your time today, Jasmine.
Oh, thank you so much again for having me.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Mike Strelo. Editing by Area Code Audio. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.